This is CKnappenberger, and this is my Module 8, my case study for EDL853 in the spring of 2018. The case study is titled, Get This Child Out of My Room. The case study discusses how a general education teacher has requested that a special education teacher essentially rewrite a student's IEP or change a student's IEP in order to make sure that the student is placed outside of her classroom. Category 1, my problem identification and analysis. Things that I know. Mrs. Taylor is a third grade general education teacher at Schuyler Elementary School. Ms. Green is a special education teacher at Schuyler Elementary School. And Carl is a third grader who has been diagnosed with behavioral disorder at Schuyler Elementary School. Ms. Green is new to the district. She's also new to teaching. This is her first year. She's straight out of college. And Mrs. Taylor has been teaching for about 10 years at Schuyler Elementary School. Other things that I know, 6 weeks into the school year, Carl's behavior seems to have changed. He was originally self-abusive, and now he's become aggressive towards Mrs. Taylor. Mrs. Taylor has requested that Ms. Green remove Carl from her classroom. She comes to talk to Ms. Green every day about how Carl's behavior makes him that he shouldn't be in her class. He shouldn't, his behavior has been very aggressive and he needs to get out of her classroom. Please remove him from the classroom. Ms. Green recognizes her frustration and understands that she does want him removed and that is what she would like to do, but she is aware that his intellectual capabilities say that he probably should be staying in the placement that he's in presently. So Ms. Green is really at a loss as to what she could do. Because she's at a loss, she then refers to Mrs. Wills, the district coordinator for special education. She goes to ask Mrs. Wills what she should do and kind of what could be the proper course of action. Mrs. Wills recommends an intervention plan and how an intervention plan should be written. Ms. Green develops the plan and then she tries to schedule an IEP meeting in order to get parental permission. So she tries to kind of work it out so that she can have a meeting with the parents and with Mrs. Taylor and herself in order to kind of get this approved. She does get the superintendent's permission. She's looking at, according to Carl's file, his parents have recently and bitterly been divorced. There's been a lot of police intervention along with the divorce. So there seems to be a lot of bitterness and anger between the parents. Carl's mother, Mrs. Hughes, although both parents are given joint custody of the children, Mrs. Hughes, they're living in her home and she's responsible for most of the child rearing responsibilities. So at the IEP meeting, both Mr. and Mrs. Hughes are present. Mrs. Hughes verbally attacks Mr. Hughes and says basically this is all of his fault. Mr. Hughes basically says, whatever you need to do, give me the papers, sign them. I'm going back to work. I don't have time for this. During the meeting, Mrs. Taylor does speak to the parents, and Mrs. Taylor speaks about how she kind of indirectly suggests an alternate placement. She loves the kid. She wants him to do well. She thinks another academic placement might be best. Ms. Green introduces the intervention plan at the meeting, and they've decided that, the mother is very upset and she's trying really hard and everyone seems to be trying really hard, but nothing's working. And so they kind of go along with the intervention plan. After the meeting is over, Mrs. Taylor makes a comment to Ms. Green, basically saying that the person that Ms. Green replaced would have normally just removed the child from the classroom and put them into a detention room with a workbook to do work. And again, Ms. Green is kind of at a loss as to what to do. Being at the meeting and seeing how the parents interacted with each other and also how Mrs. Taylor acted, she kind of understands kind of why it is that Carl is acting the way he is, and that some of it kind of makes more sense because, like we said, intellectually he's capable of working in the general education classroom, but behaviorally something needs to be done in order for him to kind of stay in that placement and to be successful in that placement. Things that I need to know is that if Mrs. Taylor has tried any other interventions with Carl or for Carl, are the parents willing to continue interventions at home? It seemed that the father was kind of passive about everything and the mother kind of seems upset and wants to help. Kind of, is she willing to continue some of these interventions at home to kind of get a more well-rounded but more well-rounded plan for the student? Is there another third grade classroom Carl can go to? It seems that Mrs. Taylor is unwilling to do things. So if that would be kind of like a last ditch effort. But if there is another place Carl can go, how does Carl respond to the intervention plan? Because it hasn't even really been put into place yet. And kind of once it is put into place, how does Carl respond? Also, how does Carl respond to Miss Green? It seems like there hasn't been an aggressive outburst towards Miss Green. So kind of how does that go? How does, kind of he interact when he is with Miss Green? Also, is there an administrator or another staff member who's willing to work with Carl in order to kind of put this plan into place and make sure that it does work for the student? The problem as I see it is that Mrs. Taylor is unwilling to work with the student in order to prevent and properly address his negative behavior. Therefore, Mrs. Taylor is not meeting the needs of all of her students. The action plan. I have two areas of focus for my action plan. The first being neutralizing the threat Carl is posing to the class, kind of working towards making the intervention plan that Ms. Green has developed work. My other area of focus is coaching Mrs. Taylor in ways to better address all of our students' needs and all of their behaviors. Looking at the threat first, Ms. Green needs to go monitor Carl in Mrs. Taylor's class. It mentioned that she had already done that, but I think that needs to be revisited again. And then Ms. Green also needs to be the one who discusses the intervention plan with Carl. It doesn't seem like he would be very responsive to Mrs. Taylor, so Ms. Green should be the one who does that. Also, if Carl becomes a threat to another student, or the intervention plan needs to be reevaluated to make sure that it's benefiting all of the students. Ms. Green can speak to Mrs. Taylor's students and see how they feel about her class this year. Again, not asking about Carl, just asking in general, kind of what works, what they like, what they don't like about Mrs. Taylor's class, so that Ms. Green can get a better kind of view of kind of how all students are performing in Mrs. Taylor's class and how to best benefit Carl in that room. I also think that Mrs. Wills should come in to observe the intervention plan in action. We want her to be able to evaluate Carl's placement. If it's not just coming from Ms. Green and it's also coming from the coordinator for special services, that this might be kind of an easier, I guess, pill to swallow for Mrs. Taylor to kind of know that like we are doing what's benefiting the student and that this is kind of his placement and where he should be. Looking at Mrs. Taylor, not only having Mrs. Wills come into her class and to observe Carl with the intervention plan in place and kind of see how things are going so that Mrs. Taylor can see that it's not just a teacher kind of instituting this on her own. It has the support of administration. Provide her with the specifics of the plan, a copy of the plan, show her how to carry the plan out, have someone else discuss it with her if it could be an administrator and not just Ms. Green, so that Ms. Green, doesn't seem to be the one who keeps getting attacked for it. Also provide her with professional development. Simply because she's been teaching for a while doesn't mean that she's ever had experience with students who have, behavioral diagnosis or anything like that. So kind of looking at what she could do, student-teacher relationships, most specifically looking at strategies for students who have behavior disorders, so that she can get some professional development on how to deal with students in that realm of education. Also allowing her leave time to observe other classes, looking for a master teacher who has experience dealing with students who have behavioral disorders or who have IEPs, and kind of these teachers have good rapport with those students. Again, Mrs. Taylor might be a master teacher for third grade general education, but that does not make her a master teacher in dealing with students with IEPs and also students with behavioral disorders. Looking at strategies for implementation, using the resources that are available to you. Administration, having Mrs. Wills come in, also having any other kind of administration come in to observe and kind of say that this plan is correct. Observing other teachers. This is big. Seeing how other teachers interact with students who are similar or have similar behaviors to Carl. Treating all students with maturity and respect. Again, looking at the idea of following an IEP, following the intervention plan, making sure Ms. Green is following it as well as Mrs. Taylor. And again, going back to that professional development, providing the professional development to her for strategies for dealing with students whose behaviors are like Carl or for students who have Carl's behaviors. Also allowing leave time to observe those master teachers. Again, not taking away from Mrs. Taylor, but recognizing that she may need assistance in looking at how other teachers handle similar situations. My category 3, resolve the issue based on promotion of success of all students. What's best for the students? What's Carl and all the other students is staff providing consistent and appropriate discipline for actions. So looking at that he is being handled appropriately, the actions that and how he's behaving. Also interacting with teachers who care about their well-being and success. Carl is struggling. He doesn't have adults who want, or he feels as though want him to be successful. So what's best for him is having teachers who kind of put that out there. Some of my data for best practice. First thing is Mrs. Taylor needs to know how to address Carl's behaviors. In the case study, it says, you have to take him out of my class. No, that's probably not best for him all the time. Removing him isn't the best way to go. And Mrs. Taylor needs to find strategies or learn strategies to deal best with kind of Carl's behaviors, because removing him isn't intellectually what's best for him. Carl's behaviors do need to be addressed. Slamming books, throwing objects, yelling at other students. He needs to know that he can't behave in this manner, and he needs to know that there are consequences for doing those things and kind of behaving in those manners. One of the biggest things is that Carl doesn't feel valued in Mrs. Taylor's class. She says in there that his anger is really only directed towards her, and that it's not directed towards anybody else or any of the other students. So because of this, we need to kind of address not only Carl's behaviors, but also the way that Mrs. Taylor is dealing with them. Debriefing the problem. What am I thinking? I'm thinking that all the adults need to be on the same page here. Teachers, parents, all the adults kind of need, for this to be a success, all the adults need to get on the same page. I'm feeling frustrated towards a lot of the adults in this situation in order kind of that Carl's needs aren't being met. And I'm valuing the fact that Carl needs to feel valued, respected, and cared for at school, because that doesn't seem to be happening at home. So we want to make sure that is happening in the school environment. Some of my unresolved issues. Mrs. Taylor's commitment to Carl. We need to make sure that she's committed to this program and committed to professional development and kind of doing what's best for the student, not what's easiest for her. Parents' commitments towards following through at home. I don't know if that's going to happen. We're not sure. There's a miscommunication. Also, Carl's willingness to work with the intervention plan. We have the adults working, but we also need to make sure that Carl's willing to do it as well. My category 5, reflection on standard 2. How I promoted academic success and enhancing instructional capacity. Students were the driving force here. We want to provide Carl's needs. We're valued in deciding what actions to take and kind of what action plan. Also, the intervention plan is going to be, if Carl's behaviors are affecting any of the other students negatively, it'll be adjusted and kind of looked at. We want to make sure that, all the instruction that's occurring in Mrs. Taylor's class is positive, and then students feel safe and cared for, Carl as well as all of the other students. So we made sure that they were at the force of the action plan. They are also, Carl was valued in all of this, and that things can be adjusted if any kind of instruction is interrupted. Promoted the well-being of every student. Miss Green wanted what was best for Carl, which is why he wasn't removed from Mrs. Taylor's class. That wasn't part of the plan. If Carl is removed temporarily, it's done for the safety and well-being of all of the students and with minimal instructional disruption. That's why the plan is in place. That's why there are steps to follow in order to make sure that instruction is not being interrupted. Also, moving forward, all students are going to benefit from Mrs. Taylor's professional development. Her watching other teachers, her going to different professional developments in order to kind of deal with students' behaviors. All of her students moving forward are going to benefit from that. Finally, enhancing instructional capacity. Again, all students are going to benefit from Mrs. Taylor's professional development. All students are allowed to share their opinions about how they learn in Mrs. Taylor's class. Positives and negatives. What works, what doesn't work, what do you like, what do you not like. And again, these are not kind of gotchas for Mrs. Taylor. This is just so Miss Green has a better idea, and also any kind of administration that comes in, Mrs. Wills or anyone else who comes in, the students' opinions were valued and kind of taken into what instructional things kind of work best for them in that room. Finally, Mrs. Taylor observing other teachers is going to really help her improve her instructional ability. She's going to see how other teachers handle students similar to Carl, how other teachers kind of manage different behaviors inside of the classroom, especially students who have diagnosed behavioral disorders. Okay, thank you. That was my case study.